Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, everyone. This is Cynthia Benz, and thank you all so much for taking the time to be with us today. This is the first in the series of three roundtables for a PCORI project that the Personalized Medicine Coalition has been leading. The title is Moving Beyond Population Averages, a roundtable to develop a patient-centered research agenda advancing personalized medicine. Next slide, please. So first, I'd like to go over who at the PMC is a part of the project team. Many of you have been involved in the project from the beginning and have heard quite a bit from me and from David Davenport. But there's actually four of us at the Personalized Medicine Coalition who have been leading the project. David and I are primarily the project managers and leads for the project, but Fasuila Sampson, who I'd like to recognize today, has done just a tremendous job of making sure that we have been able to get to the point that we're at with the project and remain on task and on budget. Daryl Pritchard, who's the Senior Vice President of Public Policy at the Personalized Medicine Coalition, has been assisting us and will continue through the end of the project in making sure that the work that we're doing meets the rigors that it needs to ultimately integrate into the knowledge base and how we can advance personalized medicine. So in addition to myself and David, these are the other colleagues at PMC who make up the project team. Next slide. So I'll quickly walk through the agenda of what you can expect for today's roundtable. Currently, you're in the welcome and introduction portion of the program. I will go over a bit of baseline information related to personalized medicine, since some of you are newly joining the project. I'll go over what has gotten us to this point in the project and what we hope to achieve, where this roundtable really fits in what we ultimately hope to deliver by the end of our project. And then we're all kind human beings, but we will have some ground rules for discussion, recognizing that a number of you who are participating today don't regularly participate in these types of meetings, and we want to make sure that you feel empowered to express your views. I'll then turn it over to our moderator. She will go through a moderated discussion that's focused on the patient-centered principles that you had received in your meeting packet and how they lay the foundation for what we're doing with the project. And then we'll have a group discussion. David went through a little bit of this in the pre-meeting room that will help us to refine research questions that will be included in the white paper. Next slide. And then at the very end, we'll do a summary because this is the first in a series of three. We'll take a minute to talk about what we felt were some of the key takeaways from the discussion, receive any additional feedback from you, and the process for engagement after this roundtable. And then we will encourage you strongly to fill out an evaluation survey. And then we'll promptly conclude at 3 o'clock. Next slide. So this is the first of our polling questions. The poll is now live. If you look over on the right-hand side of your screen, you should be able to maximize a series of responses. And we just like to get a bit of an understanding from you of what your knowledge is of personalized medicine. So if you can just select your result now. Well, okay, it looks like we're about halfway. Okay, it looks like we're going to close the poll, and from what we can see, a number of you have an understanding of personalized medicine or use it in your profession or advocate for personalized medicine. Next slide. So this is really to ground the discussion for those of you who aren't familiar with personalized medicine or how we've been thinking about it throughout the project. The way we define personalized medicine is an evolving field in which physicians use diagnostic tests, often molecular, to determine which medical treatments will work best for their patients. By combining that data from those tests with an individual's medical history, circumstances, values, healthcare providers and patients develop targeted treatment and prevention plans. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's important, the second half of the definition later on. Next slide. So what is patient-centered outcomes research? Patient-centered outcomes research helps people and their caregivers communicate and make informed healthcare decisions, allowing their voices to be heard and assessing the value of healthcare options. This research answers patient-centered questions such as, given my personal characteristics, conditions, and preferences, what should I expect will happen to me? What are my options? What are the potential benefits and harms of these options? What can I do to improve the outcomes that are most important to me? And how can clinicians and the care delivery systems they work in help me to make the best decisions about my healthcare? Next slide. And so we embarked on this project recognizing that there are some fundamental gaps in awareness and evidence that impact the speed at which personalized medicine is integrated into the healthcare system. We believe that personalized medicine and the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, we all share the same goal of shifting healthcare from one-size-fits-all to trial and error approach. And we want to get at that targeted approach that utilizes the patient's characteristics and preferences to inform their healthcare decisions. And so we have been engaging with stakeholders across the healthcare spectrum for a little over a year to lay the foundation for the research agenda that we'll deliver at the end of this project. We've looked quite a bit in the early part of this project at some of the successes in personalized medicine adoption. But even within those successes, and some of the panels will highlight this, there have been areas where there is a lot of room for improvement. And we recognize that that both of these are learning experiences that we can use to build both the principles that are defined by patients and inform the research questions that we hope that we can answer by the end of this meeting. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, it's a 2-year project. We've been convening a large group of patients and patient advocates and caregivers and a handful of other stakeholders early on in a series of also virtual formats to establish the patient-centered principles for what they believe should be in the research agenda. We, about halfway through the project, formed a multi-stakeholder advisory committee to help translate those principles into some draft research questions that they felt would be impactful, and we're going to discuss those during this meeting. We initially envisioned coming together with all of you in person to hold this meeting, so we appreciate your flexibility in doing this in a 3-part virtual format. But this is really to refine the research questions and also to identify if there are additional questions we should be considering because this is a larger group and much more diverse perspectives. So we want to make sure that the research questions that come out of this are feasible and something that's actionable. Our end date for this project is the end of August. So by then we will publish a white paper with the final research agenda included, and it'll also include a summary of this roundtable discussion. And then we're going to go through a series of activities to disseminate the research agenda. We hope that it'll inform future research studies and that a number of you, particularly the patient and caregiver representatives who are on this call, we hope that you will feel empowered to participate potentially as partners to others in the research community to help answer some of these questions. We would be very excited if that was something that came out of this. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute funded this project. It was through the Eugene Washington Engagement Award Program. And the reason that it was the recipient of one of those awards is because, in part, we're looking to establish partnerships between patients and researchers and build a community that's really equipped to not only inform research, but also participate as research partners in advancing patient-centered clinical effectiveness. Next slide. So these are the 9 themes that were identified during the first series of virtual web forums that we held with the patient community, and I'll run through these. They were something that we felt very strongly we needed to better understand, particularly in informing the second half of the personalized medicine definition of understanding a person's values and circumstances. So the first web forum, we were very focused on getting from the patient and caregiver participants the way that they were viewing their definition of patient and caregiver value and circumstances. And some of that information was included in your packet. It was very extensive and comprehensive, and I think went well beyond what many of us would typically think a person's values and circumstances would consider. The research agenda, we thought, should look primarily, based on those conversations, at improving patient and provider communications, as well as improving ways of educating patients and providers about personalized medicine products and services, and how that fits into the healthcare landscape. Also, looking at access challenges is something that we didn't really think about in terms of the way that coverage and affordability were really influencing patient and provider conversations and ultimately decision-making about testing and treatment. And while we know that that's not a primary focus for the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, we think that that research questions that are aimed at least exploring those access challenges would be something that are worth reflecting in our research agenda. And then representativeness, and I think that's one of the reasons why this group is so large and diverse in understanding of personalized medicine and also their range of experiences. But we wanted to make sure that that those voices ultimately informed the research questions that came out. And then lastly, the questions we hope are research projects that would ultimately make an impact. And we also, at this point, feel that it needs to be something that's feasible to achieve. So we really hope that you will keep that in mind. Next slide. So these are the 2 objectives for the roundtable. You did receive a list of research questions that were developed in consultation with the advisory committee. We're looking to really refine the language of those questions, look at ways to prioritize them, as long as it's rooted in the patient-centered principles that I just laid out. And then we would like to have some discussion, and Susan will get into this, to really look at if there are suggestions for additional research questions that we should pursue. Next slide. So this is the second polling question. We just would like you to let us know how you would identify yourself for the purposes of this project. It should be open. And David, if you can, let me know when the poll is done, because I can't tell. It's not giving me the results.
Looks like we still have some people selecting their options.
Okay, thanks. It won't let me vote either, so.
Oh,
Hi, it won't let me vote.
It took it now. Try it again. It took mine now.
Okay, great. There we go. Okay, it's working.
All right, it looks like the responses have tailed off, so we can go ahead and end the poll.
Perfect. And it looks like what we anticipated, more than half of the participants are either patients, patient advocates, or caregivers, or representatives from a patient advocacy organization, and the remainder are healthcare professionals and or academic researchers and outcomes research. Terrific. Next slide. Okay, and this just, we wanted to give you a bit of a flavor for who's participating. I won't go through the extensive list. We just want to make sure that you all are aware from the advocacy community. We are not just primarily focused on cancer. We're also thinking of these research questions from the context of how they would apply for disease areas where there isn't currently a personalized medicine approach to treatment, but there is the hope that there will be on the horizon, or there's a pretty well-defined diagnostic component that would lend itself to personalized medicine. And then in terms of area of expertise, it's very wide-ranging, but we wanted to be sure that there was representation for both large academic medical centers, as well as how personalized medicine is practiced in the community setting, as well as other members of the healthcare team, just physicians, but also genetic counselors, nurses, nurse educators. We think that that's an incredibly important perspective as well. So next slide. So these are the ground rules for discussion. We just want to be sure that you introduce yourself when you speak, and you're all doing a great job with that so far. We like you to be respectful and know that you all can be. We've had a great discussion with all of you previously. We'd like you to share the mic, but if you feel like you're speaking too much, but you still have something that you want to say, please feel free to say it. If you are confused or need clarification, don't be shy. Please feel free to ask. If it's at all possible, speak from your own experience and your experience as a patient or caregiver. We know not to critique other people. It's really about the ideas, and if you have something to say, please focus on ideas. And then to the extent we can, please just build off of other comments you've heard and work toward a shared understanding. Next slide. Recognize that each participant has a different perspective and expertise. And so if you feel like that it may be something that's more basic, please don't dismiss it, because we do value what everyone has to say. Consider and be willing to address the diversity of patient needs, diseases, backgrounds, and experiences. So we know that many of you in cancer are very familiar with personalized medicine, but recognize that in other areas not be. And if you do have something that you don't feel was reflected in the discussion, we also included a question about this in the evaluation survey. Please feel free to follow up with David or I after the roundtable, because if it's something that you feel was very important, we want to make sure that we bring it up in the next two sessions. And understand that we may not have the answers and you may not have the answers, but feel free to ask the question, because that definitely needs to be recognized in the research agenda. Next slide. Okay, now I have the pleasure of introducing your moderator for today. Susan McClure is the CEO of Genome Creative. It's the first consulting firm in the nation focused on educating lay people about how our lives are changing through our increased understanding of DNA. Susan leads an expert team of award-winning strategists, project managers, science writers, and storytellers at Genome Creative, and they all share Susan's passion for helping to making people more informed about their healthcare decisions. Susan's expertise with everything that we're going to talk about over the next few sessions is not just something that's been cultivated through her professional life, but also her personal life. She has served as a journalist and the publisher of notable journals such as Cure Magazine, as well as Genome Magazine. She's also a two-time cancer survivor. My colleagues and I at PMC have had the pleasure of working with Susan for many years now. She previously served on PMC's board of directors. But the one thing that you won't find in any of her bios, and it's something that we've had the pleasure of experiencing firsthand, is how bright, kind, and fun she is. She really is a lovely human being, and you're going to discover just how much during today's roundtable and the two that follow. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susan in her very capable hands. So next slide, please.
All right. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, you nod your head. That's a good thing. So I don't see my camera yet. But first of all, thank you so much for just allowing me to be part of this incredibly important conversation. We're joined by a group of esteemed panelists representing the diversity of the patient experience. They are Laura Holmes Haddad, who is a mom, a writer, and a stage 4 breast cancer survivor. We have Gabriela Balasa, or Ella, as we like to call her. She's a cystic fibrosis patient and patient advocate. We have Grace Whiting, who's the president and CEO of the National Alliance for Caregiving. Hello, Grace. And we have Adolphe Falcone, who is the executive vice president of the National Alliance for Hispanic Health. So I need to tell you that the group chat is not working right now. So if you have questions that you guys would like to ask, and I encourage you to do so, this is a really bright group of panelists who would love to engage with you. Go ahead and put your questions in the moderator chat function, because I can see those, and I will be scanning those as our presenters are talking, and we'll be sure to ask those questions while you guys are muted during the course of the conversation. So with that, first off, I would like to introduce Laura Holmes Haddad. Laura, as I said, is a writer and mom. She is notably known for writing about food and wine, as I recall, and so I'm sure it was quite a shock to her when she was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer and went on a mission to write about that. She's the author of an amazing book called This is Cancer: Everything You Need to Know from the Waiting Room to the Bedroom. The book has been dubbed Cancer's version of What to Expect When You're Expecting, which I think is fabulous. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Laura, who is going to share her experiences first. But I believe we're seeing Grace on the, there she is. Okay, take it away, Laura.
Thank you, Susan, for that very kind introduction. I'm so happy to be here and add my patient experience to this really important conversation. So my experience with precision medicine started in the fall of 2012. I was 37. My 2 kids were 14 months old and 4 years old. And what I thought was just being a tired mom and having some pain from breastfeeding turned out to be stage 4 inflammatory breast cancer. It affected axillary nodes, a clavicle node, a rib lesion, and I had an 11-centimeter tumor. So within a week, I began standard treatment, but within 2 cycles, it became clear that I was not responding to treatment. And my community oncologist said there was nothing more they could do. And we drove to ACCC, where at UCSF, I met an oncologist who performed genetic tests. And then using that genetic material, that genetic information, told me that the only hope for me would be a clinical trial involving a PARP inhibitor. And he searched for a non-placebo, non-randomized trial for me. And what I would find out later was that over 30 days, I was rejected 5 times until I was accepted on a compassionate use waiver. So in February 2013, I became a clinical trial participant at City of Hope in Los Angeles, and I traveled from San Francisco to Los Angeles every week for this trifecta of chemotherapy agents, including an investigational drug. And mercifully, luckily, I was a super responder, and in June 2013, we found out that the investigational drug had shrunk my tumor, making me a surgical candidate. I followed up with surgery, radiation therapy, and then I resumed the investigational drug. I was supposed to remain on it the rest of my life. Fast forward to May 2015, I was living my life. I was very grateful, but I was on 800 milligrams a day of the investigational drug. And It was very hard, to say the least. But because I had a series of clean scans, I met with my oncologist who had consulted with his coworkers and found that if I remained on the drug, it would most likely result in another form of cancer or some other harmful side effects. So I came off the drug in May 2015, and I remain NED to this day. And what I've learned since then is obviously so much more science and so much more about how to access and advocate for myself. But what really underlies it is that I was lucky. And what I wanted to say most in this panel is that we need to take luck out of the equation. Luck should not be a part of accessing precision medicine. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to hearing the other panelists and answering your questions.
Oh my gosh, Laura, what a compelling story that is. I mean, we should take luck out of the equation. So you went into therapy 1 week after diagnosis. You were just thrust into, right? You were just thrust into this world and being asked to make decisions, or really even not being asked to make decisions, right? You were just put into the cattle call gauntlet of the standard of care, and it was quickly determined that it wasn't working, and that's when started getting on the fast track. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I should say, I find this happens quite often among the patients I meet, especially as a young cancer patient with children and or other patients who are caregivers. You want to stay close to home. So that's why I believe it's about 80% of patients are treated in the community setting. And that is something we need to address, because the things like precision medicine might not be part of the initial conversation in terms of treatment options.
Right, and we're going to get to a lot of that when we start going over the research questions. But you're right, you know, in the community setting, a lot of times these conversations aren't being had. There's this idea that you have to go to an academic setting to actually become a partner in research. But that's not easy for everyone, as you pointed out. You've got kids at home. Sometimes traveling for treatment is just as difficult as having the disease itself, you know, and very costly, right?
Definitely. And as a patient, I mean, I always say I'm an English major. I was afraid of science my whole life. I would never have thought to ask. If it weren't for my family who pushed and asked the questions, I would never have thought to ask about genetic testing, or that a genetic test might open up the door for a treatment option for breast cancer. You know, it's having the knowledge and having an advocate that is so important in accessing and broadening treatment options.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. We're going to get back to you in a little bit. So now we're going to move over to Ella Balasa. She is a cystic fibrosis patient and patient advocate. She has a very compelling story to just tell people about what it's like living with cystic fibrosis, given that cystic fibrosis has long been kind of like the poster child for precision medicine and, you know, how it's impacting the lives of patients. So with that, I will turn it over to Ella.
Yes, thank you. That was such a really compelling story. Thank you for sharing, Lauren. So I was diagnosed with CF at 18 months old. And for those that may not be aware, CF is a life-limiting lung disease. And since I've been a child, I've had countless hospitalizations to receive intravenous antibiotics to treat the lung infections that are the hallmark of this disease. And these infections deteriorate lung tissue over time, and then reducing lung function and leading to respiratory failure. So I have a degree in biology, and I've worked in an environmental microbiology lab. And over the past couple of years, I've tried to become a patient advocate for advancing research in the CF space. And I've been involved in the CF community by serving on like research committees with the CF Foundation and giving input on, funding priorities and clinical trial design. And I've spoken at like the national level to raise awareness for CF and the need for novel treatment options for treating the underlying genetic cause of CF, but also for novel therapies to treat these infections as well. These are quite antibiotic resistant and can really lead to the death of somebody with CF. And so I've shared about my own research experiences, and I've also participated in an experimental treatment called phage therapy, and this is using a virus to attack bacteria in the lungs. And this is not an approved therapy either, but I got it through compassionate use, and it's tailored very specifically to the bacteria that's found in a specific person's lungs. So this is not really like genetic based, but it is still precision medicine, and there is more research being done in phage therapy, specifically in cystic fibrosis patients. And definitely phage therapy is really a new area in general. But I think there's a lot of potential for, understanding the microbiome in the lung of a specific person, and then kind of tailoring these treatments based on what bacteria is present. But also in the past year, I've been fortunate to start a new medication that does treat the underlying cause of CF. And this has brought significant health improvements for me and for many that have been able to start it. But it's only available for those with the most common genetic mutation of CF, and there are many genetic variations that cause the cystic fibrosis and mutations. And so those that have these more rare mutations have not had access to these drugs, and there's really no research as to whether these drugs may have an effect on these other mutations or not. And within this past year, actually the first personalized medicine trial has begun in CF, specifically looking at the CFTR gene in organoids, and to determine whether these new treatments, they're called modulator drugs, modulator therapies, whether they might have an effect on patient cells, regardless of the mutation. So it's dependent more on the phenotype rather than the genotype. And I think really bringing personalized medicine as a standard of care for the CF community would help the lives of many by optimizing the treatment availability. And as more of these CFTR modulators become available in the near future, I think tailoring the treatment before trying the medication and having the person ingest it systemically and seeing the effects over time, you can just examine the cells to see if a certain drug would have an effect or not. And so I think this is a new realm in the CF community, but it's very exciting and hope, to take off shortly. And so I'm really happy to be a part of this panel and providing my perspective today.
Thank you, Ella. It's fascinating. Gosh, with your degree in biology, this has to come in handy when you're looking at, what you're facing. And but at the same time, most people don't have that, right? They are just kind of at the whim of the doctors that are treating them. And you mentioned that there are targeted treatments for certain people with CF, but then and when I was launching Genome, there was a lot of talk about the targeted treatments for specific mutations in CF, but it seemed like that divided the CF community into a group of haves and have-nots. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, exactly. There's currently about 10% of people with CF don't have these treatments available to them. So it's definitely a group that does feel very left out. And yeah, there are new treatments in development, specifically looking at like mRNA treatments. But this new trial would include those patients that do have different genotypes, but may CF does manifest in very different ways for even for two people that have the same genetic mutation. And so I think it's really important to look at the phenotype and the expression of these genes to see perhaps these new medication may potentially work, but these patients are being excluded right now simply because of this mutation that they have or do not have.
Right.
And so I think that
considered off-label, right? So if it's off-label, there is a huge barrier to access.
Yes, absolutely. And that's something that I plan to talk about is that, they're not able, there's no testing. I mean, there is testing, but it's nobody knows, nobody's willing to do it. Who's going to do it? No, there's just so little information on the part of the patients and providers and on, what might happen or how can this be done, really.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your story. I can't wait to hear more from you in a little bit. I've got more questions for you later as well. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Grace Whiting, who is the president and CEO of the National Alliance for Caregiving. If you're not familiar with that organization, it's a coalition of organizations focused on family caregiving issues. They conduct research, policy analysis, they develop national programs to increase public awareness of national and family caregiving issues. So with that, I will turn it over to Grace.
Thank you, Susan. I'm so happy to be here, and I appreciate that everyone on a Friday is trying to balance their Friday with this very important discussion. So just a happy and a warm welcome. So our primary work is in understanding or quantifying the impact that disease and disability may have on the friends and family members who provide care to someone. And in our most recent research study, which actually came out about 3 weeks ago, it's conducted with AARP and has been roughly every 5 years since 1997. And in this study, we look at a statistically representative sample of the friends and family members who are providing unpaid care to someone and helping them to manage disease complexity. A couple of things that really stood out is that since we looked at this last time, there are 9.5 million more people who provide care. And in the aggregate, we're talking about 53 million Americans who are supporting an adult or a child as a caregiver. So even though we think about this as sort of something intimate, personal, that we do by ourselves at home, in the aggregate, caregivers are basically filling that gap between the long-term care system and acute care and post-acute care settings. The other thing I think is particularly relevant to this group is the fact that care coordination is getting harder. It's more complicated even than 5 years ago to try to figure out how you will help somebody manage their care from one setting to another. And I think that creates a lot of challenges for families who want to be present, they want to be good care partners, but they maybe aren't sure, how do I manage, if my loved one has lupus and they're in the hospital and they come out of the hospital and now I'm caring for them at home, what do I need to know? And how do I take care of myself to make sure I'm fully present? So that's another sort of issue we've been working on, is really thinking through, how do we build pathways for caregivers to be a part of the system and to be recognized as partners, as members of the team? The last thing I'll say is there's a balance between caregiver voice and patient voice. And in some of our work with Cynthia and David and others in the biomedical community, we have started a conversation with regulators about what that balance of voice should be. And I always think about, I was at a conference for Down syndrome, and I was eating second breakfast, as you do at conferences. So I had already had first breakfast, now I'm eating conference breakfast. And as I was standing there was an older guy in his late 40s who had Down syndrome, and his mother, who was in her 60s. And she started fussing at him about his hair sticking up. And he was saying, well, I don't know where my comb is. I left my comb back in my room. And she was like, well, you shouldn't even leave your room without a comb. And I was sitting there thinking, like, this is the challenge, right? It's like, what is the boundary between, like, when caregiving ends and where I need to support this person in their own dignity and independence and in what they want to do with their life? And if the guy wants to go out with his hair sticking up, maybe that's okay. So I think those kinds of balancing, understanding how that relationship can impact how people report out data or how they care for someone, and recognizing that caregivers need support too, whether that's workplace accommodation, respite, education and training, or just self-care. Those are the types of things we work on. And I think important when we think about how people can help partner with someone who's managing the disease or disability and trying to determine what's right for them personally.
That is an incredibly important discussion to have for sure. When I was diagnosed with cancer the first time, it was before, I don't want to say how old I am, but it was before the internet was really, taking off. And people would call, they would call the house repeatedly, 40, 50 people, every week or so wanting to know how I was doing. And I didn't want to talk to anybody. And so my husband was the one in charge of having those conversations over and over and over again. And nobody really asked him how he was doing. And I wrote about that years later. That was a big bit of remorse that I had during my treatment, that he was predominantly left out of the discussion. And when you think about the caregiver role these days and how families are so far apart many times, and you've got a loved one in another state who is going through this, what do you do to support them? If you do live nearby, do you quit your job to support them? And then the financial burden of it. My father had Alzheimer's, and the family was paying about $1,000 a month just for his care in his final stages, and the stresses that went on with that. And then also caregivers are responsible for gathering up all kinds of information, researching things, just being side by side with these patients. And so I do feel like it's such an important topic to weave into these principles. And I'm so glad you're here to join us today. So we'll get back to you in a little bit. Thank you for that,
Susan.
Next up is our final presenter, Adolphe Falcone. Adolphe is the Executive VP of the National Alliance for Hispanic Health. They are the premier science-based and community-driven organization that focuses on the best health for all. They have community-based members who provide services to more than 15 million Hispanics throughout the U.S. every year. They also have a national organization of members that provide services to more than 100 million people annually. And so this is a very important time in health to be talking about disparities. Not that it's never been, it's certainly always been, but it feels like right now it's so front and center. So I'm really happy to welcome Adolphe to this discussion. So take it away.
Actually, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. There you are. We can see you too.
Okay. All righty. Thank you all for including us in this topic. We've been working on the whole issue of inclusion in science in order to have good science for well over 30. We've been a part of requirements for inclusion in science and research since working on the 1990 Disadvantaged Minority Health Improvement Act. We worked on requirements for inclusion in the legislation that established PCORI. We did some of the very first published work on the connection between genetics and health and culture, starting in 2004, publishing a report called Genes, Culture, and Medicine. Unfortunately, we haven't seen a lot of progress. Given that this is Juneteenth, I think a little history is appropriate. One is that, we've always, underrepresented groups have always been just a few percentage points of the science database, and that continues through today, despite well over 3 decades of requirements for inclusion. And we are in danger, I think, in personalized medicine, of baking in systemic discrimination in how we deliver personalized medicine. Because we're currently developing protocols that are based on research that doesn't reflect the people that we are acting upon. And in this time, that's just not acceptable. And when we talk about representativeness, I think it's really important to think about what that is. Underrepresented underrepresented groups of the population today. The database for which personalized medicine is based on. And we're talking about equity. We have a big gap to make up. And we're talking about equity. Underrepresented groups should represent a majority plus of the participants in research, so that we can deliver truly personalized medicine that reflects the diversity of the country. If there was ever a time to be clear about what representativeness is, I think that's now. And if there was ever a time to really take a hard look at ourselves and acting science and in decision medicine, it's time to really be honest and take a hard look and understand that if we continue down the path we are currently on, as a community, we are going to be baking in systemic discrimination into personalized medicine. And I hope that's something we get a chance to talk about today.
I think that's a very, very important point to make. I wanted to know how you felt about what the All of Us research program is doing to try to reach out to minority communities to actively engage them in research. I'm sure you're keeping up with that. I'm wondering what your take on that is so far.
Yeah, so I think the All of Us research program is an example of how to do it right. Unfortunately, it's one of the very few examples we have. And I think there's some key elements. Number one, inclusion of underrepresented groups wasn't an afterthought. It was a founding principle of All of Us. It is one of the key markers that they set out for success, that the database had to be representative of underrepresented groups in order for them to say they were successful. And that manifested itself in several ways. One, representatives, advocates, patient groups from underrepresented populations weren't asked to, after it had been developed, they were asked at the beginning and were part of the design of the research program. Funding was devoted to explaining the program and in underrepresented groups and bringing in underrepresented populations. How data is collected. All of Us on a regular basis issues a public report on how they are doing in terms of inclusion. That not only does that offer transparency, it also tells you something about the values of the program. And it also and all of that has been reflected in the success of the program, and that it is one of the very few research programs out there where underrepresented population groups are in fact not underrepresented.
Agreed. And I also think that and I think these principles do a good job of bringing up just the fact that values, cultural differences, all of these things play such a significant role in a patient's ability to get the right treatment. And there's also suspicion and, barriers like that you have to overcome. You think about the Henrietta Lacks story, you think about Native Americans, and there are certain populations that just don't really trust the government. They don't trust science to really take them seriously and be respectful. And so I'm really happy that you're part of this conversation. And before we jump to the principles themselves, which I'm going to read, so it's going to take a couple of minutes, so I want to jump to that really quickly. We do have a few questions. I will say all of them are from Marissa Feneco. I hope I pronounced that right. So she's showing everybody else up. Okay, so she's asked some really good questions. One is that, this is for you, Laura. She wants to know, she said travel from San Francisco to LA must have been very difficult and expensive. How did you handle that?
It was a significant barrier, to say the least, and we didn't know to even ask about that. And what I found out later was that trial sponsors are often prohibited from offering any kind of money for travel or out-of-pocket expenses because it's seen as inducement. So it's really up to the patient and their family. So in my case, we relied on family, friends, total strangers donated airline miles to me, hotel points. The trial site often doesn't have housing available or very limited. So it was a significant financial burden. And then when I was told I would be on the drug for my entire life, the thought that I would fly down or get myself to LA every month for my new supply of drug was just, it was impossible. So my oncologist then applied on my behalf for an individual trial that could be run out of UCSF, which I didn't know that's a whole process, and that was granted. But I mean, the financial barriers are real, and they are, I'm sure, are a major reason why some participants choose not to participate in a trial. And I really try to speak and advocate about this topic.
I also just found out that Marissa is actually gathering questions for everybody, so you all are good. She's not standing anybody up. Laura, one more question for you, and that is that the investigational drug that you got is still not approved, and are you concerned that if it doesn't get approved or the company stops development that you would have to stop using it? It sounds like you stopped using it already, right?
I did, and that appointment in May 2015, I'll never forget, because my oncologist posed it as a question: do you want to come off this drug? And I had my Ziploc bag, I was like, sure. And my sister was the one who said, wait, so if she's off, she's off. We'll never get back on. And my oncologist said, I'll never forget, he said, yes, that does mean you're off, but if you ever need anything again, I will be here for you. I will help you. This is the right decision. And, unless you have someone like this on your team, I can't imagine, because you are facing questions like this. What if they stop making it? In my case, it was actually a drug intended for ovarian cancer patients, and it did not work in the majority of ovarian cancer patients, unfortunately.
Wow. That's amazing. And I've heard that story all too often. I'm very happy that you have such an incredible doctor in your corner. Okay, from Candace Henley, I would like to address the comment Susan made about the historical barriers, and she referenced Tuskegee. Well, all I'm saying is that Native Americans have been persecuted, I guess, by the government for many centuries, and in fact, they don't even speak the same language when it comes to things like cancer. And I believe, and I'm speaking from an article that we wrote about in Cure a decade ago, but they didn't even have a word for cancer because they felt that saying the word would invite it in. And you just talk about different barriers that certain cultures have. And I know that the cancer support community has done a terrific job of actually going into some of these Native American pueblos and setting up actual services for those populations in ways that speak to them, their culture, their values. But that's just such a little crack in the door, and it's long overdue, in my opinion. It's just like a tip of the iceberg of basically all the patient populations out there who, just have different values. So, okay, so with that, I'm going to jump over to reading the principles, because the principles are actually the framework for this entire project, right? And you guys have done such a terrific job of identifying what these patient-centered principles are. So I'm going to read through them quickly, and then we're going to jump into the group discussion. So the first principle is patient and caregiver values. That includes personal priorities, religious, spiritual values, societal and cultural values, including family involvement and care decisions. Values around quality of life, privacy concerns, desired level of access to and understanding the personal genetic information, beliefs about health and personal responsibility and attitudes and preferences toward end of life. Number 2, patient caregiver circumstances include the emotional state, socioeconomic situation, race, ethnicity, sex, gender, language, health literacy, ability to work, access to care, access or lack thereof of a caregiver to a caregiver, social support, cognitive abilities, attitude toward illness, example, acceptance of diagnosis, willingness to accept help, personality, system burden, health-related quality of life, ability to consent and choose, relationship with the healthcare provider, the role of patient as a caregiver, the role of patient as a caretaker, preferences of family members, treatment setting, community, academic, other, familiarity with personalized medicine and its benefits, other social determinants of health, and other expressed needs or barriers. The research agenda would be most helpful if it focused on priorities that help providers and A, identifying and communicating treatment options based on biological differences in the context of patient and caregiver values, and B, understanding the patient and caregiver circumstances and presenting treatment options in ways that highlight how a treatment aligns or does not align with those circumstances. The potential for shared decision-making tools and resources to facilitate these conversations should be explored. The research agenda should address the education of patients directly by considering A, the education of patients, caregivers, as a continuing process over time and not just at diagnosis, including basic education, defining personalized medicine and its benefits. B, how both patients, caregivers, and their providers can improve communication with each other. And C, how to choose to close the gap between patient-caregiver expectations and the reality of how and when test results and treatment options are delivered. Educational tools and resources, including those available online, should address different learning styles and levels of health literacy. Number 5, opportunities to educate providers in genomics should be considered, along with providers' varying levels of understanding of genomics and varying levels of access to new and existing resources such as translational tools, depending on their health setting, community, academic, or other, health specialization, and health discipline. So you've got pharmacists, physician assistant, genetic counselors, nurses, etc. This includes opportunities to educate providers and other healthcare professionals in training. 6, the agenda should consider how to use oncology as a prototype for patient and provider education in disease areas beyond oncology. 7, access challenges beyond those created by a lack of communication and education should also be considered. This includes timely access to novel and/or off-label therapies as a result of affordability, insurance coverage, and provider availability. This includes strategies for mitigating inequity in the proportion of variance of uncertain significance reported out for individuals of non-Western European ancestry, ethnicity, compared to those of Western European ancestry and ethnicity. Number 8, the research agenda should be representative of diverse patient needs, diseases, backgrounds, and experiences. Examples, stage of life, disease trajectory, socioeconomic status, and health literacy level, including patients underrepresented in medical research. Specifically, the research agenda should apply across disease areas. This includes considering how the research agenda can apply to additional disease areas as new personalized medicine treatments come to market. This includes potential research topics related to the management of comorbidities. The advisory committee, number 9, should consider the areas the agenda must include and exclude to have the greatest impact, including the feasibility of proposed research topics. This includes potential research topics related to artificial intelligence, data collection, data integration, and interoperability, informed consent, and patient concerns related to data and privacy access. So boy, you guys hit it out of the park, I think. The goal here, as we move to the research questions, is we want to consider first and how to reshape these questions to better address what the patients want according to those principles. So we also want to have a criteria for discussing the significance of research questions, and that would include its adherence to the patient-centered principles, its feasibility, and its impact on improving patient care. So those are the things that we really need to hone in on when we are talking about these questions. And so with that, oh, let's see, hold on, we got some more questions. Maybe I'll go to the research questions and then I will weave these into the discussion as we're going along, because I know we've got about an hour to go through these questions. There are 7 of them being posed to this group today, and I know we've got 2 more sessions coming up to explore some more. The first question: how can education, communication, and healthcare delivery strategies close the existing gap between a patient caregiver's expectations about personalized medicine and the reality of how and when test results and treatment options are currently delivered? Right now, if you guys want to unmute yourselves and make sure your cameras are on, if you want to address any of these questions, you're free to do so at this point. I would say maybe Grace, you could look at that first question and tell me kind of how do you feel about it? Do you think it captures the essence of the principles, and if there, would you change it in any way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that question about alignment and expectations is really important. One thing to consider is sort of understanding of benefit risk and understanding of the caregiver's role as a supporter in care and not as a proxy. So what I mean by that is, in the disability world, there's a lot of discussion about supported decision making, which is I'm supporting this person in their care plan. So this person says, I want to do this type of testing and I want this type of treatment, that my role in caring for them is to support them in what they want, not to substitute my own judgment for what that person might want. So I think part of this is making sure that supported decision making is there. And the only other thing that comes to mind is thinking about assessment or some formal identification of the caregiver's role. That is a best practice, particularly in Medicaid, home and community-based service waivers. But a lot of healthcare providers, they don't really acknowledge the caregiver. I mean, I always laugh because I was at urgent care one night and they had this big whiteboard and they said, okay, my caregiver is, and I want to be called this, and here's how to contact me. And of course, there was no marker for the whiteboard. I was thinking, we need some kind of formal way to actually capture information about the caregivers so that if things are being communicated around expectations, or if they're trying to help keep the patient on track, that there's some way for them to actually know who that person is and help them communicate.
That's a good point. Somebody also asked, Laura, you mentioned that somebody prompted you to ask a question about precision medicine. Who was that person? Because that really falls into this caregiver expectation also. And what was their background? I think it's important when we think about how to plan educational efforts for the broader public, going to take luck out of the equation, then we need to inform the public about what is available and what's possible. So if you could speak to that for just a second about who it was, friends and family, I believe.
It was, and this is a really crucial topic because I think the provider knowledge is just as important as the patient and caregiver knowledge, that if we want to increase health literacy around precision medicine, we need to not only address the patient, but also the provider who might not know the most current research, or there's just so much happening in that space. And for me, it's my family. My family wouldn't take no for an answer. And my dad happened to be have a background in biotech. My sister is just fighter overall. And they fought for me because I was in so much pain. I was on so many medications that there is no way, my husband was taking care of the kids. So really understanding, I think Grace, you spoke to this a little bit, understanding what the patient's position is, and then because to expect the patient alone to access this level of care, I think is just impossible. And then for me specifically to then find an oncologist who knew that this genetic test would hopefully lead to a treatment option for me was another link. So we need to really focus on so many people that are in this circle to increase knowledge.
Hi, this is Leah Berito. I am an oncologist, professor of oncology at MD Anderson, and I started the personalized medicine program in 2007. As I'm an oncologist who takes care of these patients, I would like to share my experience. This is a very, very interesting and at the same time very complicated issue. I think as we continue to conduct clinical trials to implement personalized medicine, it becomes more critical to educate all oncologists who provide patient care to these patients with cancer. But also I think it is important what we do here, that the patients will be educated about the existing treatment options. And although personalized medicine is not right now implemented across patients with cancer, I think in the United States things are better than in other countries. I think there are important matters to consider. One is that the patient is the final person to make the decision. At times I am asked to speak to patients' relatives or the caregivers rather than the patient himself or herself. I think it is important to ensure that the patient has clear understanding and makes the final decisions. At the same time, they depend on the caregivers. In my experience, I found that at times there are so many caregivers, so many children, so many conflicting interests. And therefore, it is important for the patient to appoint one caregiver who is aware of or represents accurately the patient and can help the patient make decisions. Many patients, when I see them, they're under the influence of pain medications, so they cannot think as clearly. So it is also important to provide the data in writing, such as clinical trials, the consent forms, the treatment options, and then give adequate time to patients to consider those options before making the final decision about how to go, which treatment to select. There is so much information right now, and it is so confusing for a lot of people. So I think it is important to build the trust first between the physician and the patient and the patient's family. What I find more complicated is recently with COVID-19, the second person or relatives are not allowed as they were allowed pre-COVID-19, and therefore many times we have video calls with we see patients face to face, and then we have video calls with their relatives to make sure, or caregivers to make sure that they will make the right decision. So the bottom line is this is a very important, I think, topic, and the most important strategy in determining patient's next step in management. The patient needs to make the final decision. The patient and the caregivers and everyone in their environment need to be well informed. And here's the role of the oncologist, but also of the society and all of us who generate high quality data to implement precision medicine, to make sure that the patient has access to this data and then has adequate time and is in a good, I would say, mental status, is not under the influence of medications, etc., to make decisions. And then at the end, we have to respect patients' decisions. At times, patients decide to go to hospice or to just receive standard treatment and then do nothing else. These are realistic data that we experience in daily practice. And I'd like to close here and get any questions you may have.
One question came as you were talking, and I do completely agree with that. I think sometimes the patient has a different expectation of what their quality of life needs to look like than their caregivers do, and you can't have conflicting levels of interest in that regard. Somebody asked, how do we help these people who have no family to advocate for them?
Unfortunately, this is a huge problem of our society. Patients who do not have anyone to advocate for them. I think it is, I had the privilege to take care of some of these patients, and some of them were highly educated and very well established patients, but they just didn't happen to have anyone around them, not even family members or their children. So I think we, the doctors, have to advocate for the patients. We all are responsible to make sure we offer them the best treatment possible. And in an academic institution, perhaps this is easier for patients who are seeking care in a place that doesn't have access to personalized medicine, molecular testing, access to new drugs, as patients here, for instance, that are referred to MD Anderson have, to our clinic. Then this is a challenge, but we are all responsible to raise awareness, to educate these patients, and make sure that we act on their behalf. I personally try to treat my patients based on what I would do if I were in their position, and that's how I treat them. And so far, everything has worked according to patients' wishes.
I will say I'm going to try to keep weaving these questions that you're asking through the chat function, but now that your microphones are all open, I would encourage you to introduce yourselves and ask the questions as they come up.
It's Mike Miller.
Go ahead, Mike.
It's Mike Miller with Healthy Women, and I wanted to get to the first research question, which really is about education communication with the healthcare delivery strategies. And it seems, healthcare and precision medicine is a great example. It keeps getting more specialized. And one of the challenges, or one of the opportunities that's come along is telemedicine, but that can't be used for everything, because an oncologist or different clinicians using personalized medicine are not going to be experts or have the time. So one of the things that's gone back, 20 years, and there's been a shortage of genetics counselors. It seems that one of the opportunities in healthcare delivery strategies moving forward is to have more what I would call non-physician specialists work with patients, spend more time with them, and use telemedicine, which will particularly help with expanding access for this education communication, both geographically and for people who are less able to travel or have more life burden, something I know Grace knows about from the caregiving side, and that also enables the patients and caregivers to do this together. So I guess my comment is that one of the proposed research opportunities here is to figure out how to use more non-clinician experts who can provide greater time to patients and caregivers, and particularly to do that education communication about their opportunities for personalized medicine, what their test results mean or don't mean, and do that through telemedicine. Thank you.
This is Agnes Urban.
This is Adolf. I was just going to quickly say, following up on that, one of the other opportunities, so supporting language isolated populations.
This is Agnes Urban. I wanted to echo what Mike said and make a comment about it. I'm a pediatric nephrologist from Pittsburgh, and I've been in academic medicine as well as doing research. In my opinion, we need a very complex team approach in order to provide care and education to patients. So I come from the pediatric world, and among our patients, one of the pressing issues that have been resolved is transitioning children with chronic disease, and I represent kidney disease, but it probably is true for any chronic disease, and empowering children to become adults. They get lost. Many of our pediatric patients get lost when they enter the adult world. We have been focusing on teaching children as young as 12, as they age with us, how to prepare themselves, how to become responsible adults. Unfortunately, there are very few centers and hospitals and healthcare systems that recognize this need because, and I have to say this is not profitable, especially in this climate of when many team members have been furloughed. For example, our multidisciplinary teams are being dispersed. And it is very difficult. I don't really have an answer, but I would like to pose this as a question. How can we first prevent the loss of our multidisciplinary teams, and whether this is going to be through future research? I think there's enough data already to show that because of the complexity of care, we need to maintain a multidisciplinary team approach. I don't think that we need more research to prove that, but what will be the strategy to maintain that team approach and help young people to become adults who can take care of themselves, advocate for themselves? I would like to make two comments also. In addition to advocacy groups in cancer, I would like to bring to your attention also two additional societies. One is the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, which has been a phenomenal advocacy platform for patients with cystic fibrosis. And I already described the complexities of care of patients with cystic fibrosis. They really work and advocate for patients, and there is a statement on the cystic fibrosis website and through their work that there will not be a single patient with a rare mutation left. So there is an ongoing research that focuses on those rare mutations. Another foundation is the NetCure Foundation, which advocates for children and young adults with specific forms of chronic kidney disease. So I think we can learn a lot and advocate through foundations like those in order to really have our voices heard and become successful in building these multidisciplinary teams that can educate, provide care, and advocate for our patients.
Thank you. Thank you.
Arnie Pele, if I can jump in. Unless Mike, you're up first.
Actually, yeah, we're waiting for Mike. He's been.
Go ahead, Mike.
Waiting.
Mike Raleigh?
Yes, you.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Mike Raleigh. I run the SYNGAP Research Fund. It's a relatively rare genetic epilepsy. The gene was discovered 20 years ago. The first clinical diagnosis was 10 years ago. I have about 550 patients worldwide. The majority of them are kids. And it's an incredible group that we have on this call, and I'm the least qualified person here. So let me just be brief, but I think it's important to put forward the pediatric genetic epilepsy perspective as a counterpoint to the cancer case, right? In cancer, you can sequence the tumor, you can sequence the patient, you have lots of options, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a really intensive educational component. For my population, when I read the questions about education and personalized medicine, and I'm very aligned with Adolf on this, I have a huge spectrum of patients. I have people who are very savvy with medical training. I have people who don't speak English. I have people with high school educations. And I have to explain to them that right now their diagnosis only helps us figure out which types of these these anti-epileptic drugs would be better or worse for their kids. But in 3 to 5 years, we're going to have ASOs, and in 5 to 7 years, we might have repurposed drugs. And then after that, there's things called AAVs and base editing that sound like sci-fi, but in a decade, they might be real. And if you're kids too, you should have hope. And that's why I wore this shirt today, is because I see my job as a patient advocate as helping parents know that science is changing so fast that they should hang on and they should stay tuned. But the challenge before me as a patient advocacy group is to have that conversation with people who have PhDs and MDs that are parents and people who haven't finished high school. So I need everything from a 3-page brief that explains all those words I just knocked out and why I believe they're coming, and a cartoon video that explains, you have a good copy and a bad copy, and because you're haploinsufficient, insufficient, we can upgrade. There's hope. And what I want to do is I want to keep parents engaged. And I'm of all the things I've read, there's a paper, and I'll share it back to PMC, that showed a positive correlation with people with treatment-resistant epilepsy between patient health literacy and QOL, quality of life. And the relationship was like 1 to 6 in terms of points measured. And so for me, what SRF, my organization, does is we drive patient health literacy day and night. I'm constantly trying to educate parents because I want them to A, have hope, but B, I want them to be better informed in these conversations. And I think Mike Miller mentioned earlier, we need to train non-physicians. I've been thinking a lot about how I train my patient ambassadors to have not misleading scientific conversations, but give patients the basic tools to walk into those precious neurologist appointments and those even more precious genetic counseling appointments and use those 30 to 45 minutes that happen every 6 to 12 months really well. So yes, we need complex care teams, but they're impossible to schedule. So, how do we empower these caregivers for kids who, in my case, have intellectual disability and the parents are exhausted because our kids don't sleep, and empower them to use those meetings well, but to stay hopeful? I'm sorry if I've taken too long, but just another perspective when we think in years and have chronic cases and therapies that aren't ready.
For the rare conditions, you want peer educators. Those one parents can help other parents of other kids understand what's going on because they're clinicians.
Yeah, but it can be a tragic game of telephone if you don't empower them. I mean, you know what I mean? The messages can get lost if they don't have support for those conversations.
So part of that, Mike, is that people need, for most caregivers and for rare disease caregivers in particular, they report that they have a sense of grief or loss related to caregiving, and they're often in a complicated grieving process where they're trying to be present in the moment and have hope, but also sort of grappling with this. So I think a big part of that is just behavioral health support, understanding the impact of behavioral health support for the caregiver in order to manage those feelings of grief, anger, guilt, shame, you name it. And we see researchers on the cancer side. I'm thinking of Francis Lewis at the University of Washington, who has an awesome TED Talk about caregiving and late-stage cancer. So you see that in cancer where people look at behavioral health interventions for the caregiver. There needs to be something like that for parents of kids with serious illness. And as far as I know, there's nothing out there right now to really help people do that. But that could help people reframe this as, it's not all bad, it's not all good, it's sort of in the middle.
So that's a wonderful comment. Arnold, you wanted to say something.
Susan. Yeah, hi, thanks. So I'm sitting in a genomic medicine center in New Jersey, near COVID center, unfortunately, which we've had a lot of difficult time with. And we founded this center 10 years ago. I'm a primary care physician, advanced trained genetics, and I'll give you the good and the bad, the ugly. The good and the bad is that we have a genomics center. It's a multidisciplinary team. We have genetic counselors in the next rooms adjacent to where I'm chatting, dietitians and other staff working with us. And it's worked out well. The bad news is that it hasn't worked out exactly as I would have hoped, talking about caregivers and public involvement. We designed the program with the hope that it would really percolate through the community, both to the primary care and other specialty physicians. And that has not worked as well as one would have hoped for a number of reasons, including the very fact that genetics is a complex field. And a lot of our colleagues just don't know enough about it, don't know always the opportunities, when to refer. And again, we always focus a lot on oncology, which is a really key winning area for genetics, but it goes through the neurology, it goes through pharmacogenetics, it goes through a number of areas. So we are always battling, trying to get our colleagues to know more about that, be they medical students, residents, or practicing physicians in the community. On the other side of the coin is trying to get the lay population also more attuned and aware of the opportunities in genetics. We were again fortunate on a positive end to get foundation funding from some community business leaders, Jacobs Levy Group. But on the flip side, it is always a struggle to get the lay population who hear bits and pieces about this I have to say, when there's articles in the New York Times, when there's pieces out there, the gene on Netflix stations, you get a little percolation up of this type of information. But sadly, you can't always maintain a consistent awareness. And I think this type of a roundtable, if it's going to succeed, has to find ways to really get genetics, genomics, personalized care into the day-to-day awareness of the general population. So it's not the rare individual who asks their physician or oncologist, is there another opportunity? It becomes the norm. What are the personalized probabilities? It shouldn't be you have to advocate for yourself. It should be expected of the patients, caregivers, and the physician community in general. And that's the struggle I think we're seeing probably across the country with wins and losses up and down. Thank you.
That's a great comment, and I've been on so many different panel discussions where people want to avoid setting patients up for disappointment, and so they don't want to educate patients unless there is an actual targeted treatment available for them. But as Mike pointed out, well, what about just finding out what's driving your disease? There's some relief in knowing that, and it also encourages people then to participate in research and to learn more about their disease and keep an eye on what's coming down the pike. And so I think a general awareness campaign is very, very important. Ronit?
Can I add one thing about that?
Yes.
In terms of genetics, in terms of my specific gene, BRCA, but I'm sure there are other genes that impact the people in the family besides the patient, is that, for example, once I discovered I was a BRCA2 carrier, then that impacted my sister's health, my niece's health, my mother's health. So I think the education component is so important that maybe it's not necessarily treatment, but how is it passed on, the hereditary impact. Of course, I think about my children, both my son and my daughter. So I think that conversation needs to be important. And as the doctor pointed out, it needs to trickle down to primary care, to pediatrics, so that patients can talk about their family members and the impact beyond themselves.
Susan, kind of follow up for 1 second. I'm sorry about that. You know, one of the key ways we may win this battle, I hate to say it, is the electronic health records are really becoming mainstay in physicians, providers' offices, and certain of the larger formats, Epic being one of them, and a few of the others, are working with formats with Cleveland Clinic, for example, to build into the algorithms that are used by physicians, particularly primary care providers, et cetera, nurse practitioners, PAs, et cetera. So when you get a family history, as Ms. Haddad was saying a minute ago, you almost are prompted immediately to be asking about other family members. Have you brought in other family members to be evaluated? This is how it's going to work more and more, because we're not going to easily get the general physician provider community to know all the right questions to ask, but you can build in software to have considerations for that. And I do think in the next 5 to 10 years, it may become standardized. I certainly hope it is, where when you take a history, a medical assistant, if prompted with certain answers, will say, have you had or considered genetic testing? That is one of the ways we're going to succeed in this particular area to promulgate this across the general community.
I'd like to point out that we need to be careful how we refer these patients. So at MD Anderson, patients who are diagnosed with BRCA2 as altering mutations, as well as other mutations, this prompts a referral to a geneticist. So these patients do need genetic counseling because it affects their families. Now, I do agree with the previous speaker that we should somehow standardize this approach, this process, so patients will not be forgotten, or every patient has the right to access this information and to be seen by a geneticist. On the other hand, I would like to mention that there are alterations that also are considered probably to be associated but not as clear. And we need to make sure that an expert will review this data before all these patients are referred. So in other words, the data need somehow to be curated by experts in genetics and oncology so that patients, the right patients will be referred to the right doctors. And I don't think a system alone, automatic system will be to refer patients directly will be the most efficient way. I think patients get confused with so much information, so many genetic alterations. We need to prioritize because at the end of the day, they want to be treated first, but in parallel, of course, they're worried about their families. So we need to make sure that the experts are included, and this is done in the most multidisciplinary approach possible. Thank you.
That's a great comment. Ronan?
Can I say something?
Yeah. Yes, it's Ronan. Okay, and then Candace, you are after Ronan. I just wanted to make sure everybody got a chance to talk. And I will say one more thing. We've heard a lot from physicians and we've heard a lot from advocacy groups, and we've got a lot of patients on this call who might be a little intimidated to speak up. I hope you're not, because this is all about you and your experiences, and so we encourage you to just jump right in there. And if you want to use the chat function when you have a question, I will make sure to tee you guys up in order of your questions being asked.
Okay, so hi, I'm Renee Yarden. I am an academic researcher, a cancer geneticist, and until recently also was a patient advocacy group, the Colorectal Cancer Alliance. And we have done this. I want to kind of reiterate and agree with a lot of what the speaker said about the extending the communications between physicians and patients and caregivers, and maybe adding even another level of within the care team as well. We have done recently a survey with over 300 patients and caregivers responding to personalized medicine questions. We found out that only less than 50% of patients are receiving their information about their biomarkers from their physicians, and another 40% are receiving it from patient advocacy groups. So there's definitely patient advocacy groups are filling some of the void in communications on personalized medicine and treatments and biomarkers and the information that patients and caregivers need to know. The other point I want to make is that within this survey, we found out that even though our caregivers and our patients were mostly highly educated in our population, and 30% had a graduate degree, still many of them claimed that they did not understand all the different information they received while the patient also was on treatment. So I think there's definitely need to be some kind of a way to introduce those concepts that could be difficult in a way that maybe in writing, maybe in different ways, have a specific person that is educated but can speak in layperson terms, part of the care team, to have the caregivers and the patients understand what is the information and how is it pertain to their treatment. And so I do think that with the communication needs to be expanded, but to the point also of the physicians themselves, I think they need to, until there's other care teams that are important, I think they need to make the effort to really explain those personalized medicine information for the patients as much as possible.
Thank you. Candace, you had something that you wanted to say. Candace Henley.
Hi, thank you so much. I wanted to address that the communication process needs to be both doctor and patient. And so when I say that, especially when it relates to the African American community, what we're finding recently is not recently, but researchers are not very familiar with the historical nature of fears as it relates to minority communities. And when they do, they often land on either Henrietta Lacks or the Tuskegee experiment, which is not the beginning of our mistrust. The beginning of our mistrust starts in 1619 when African Americans were brought over to America. The healthcare system was not designed for African Americans. We were designed to be research subjects. So when you talk about education and communication and why minorities struggle with participating in precision medicine, clinical trials, all of these things that has to do with research, even no matter how much you're telling them that this is in the best interest of their condition, if you are not, as the researcher, the geneticist, the clinician, and anyone in medicine is not familiar with the historical nature, you fail the minority community. And so it's very important that the education piece to the minority population that you're dealing with, that you understand the historical fears, the cultural fears and the taboos, and the religious barriers and cultural, that might prevent that patient from listening or participating in what it is that you're saying. And even if it is in the best, you can tell me it's in the best interest for me all day long. However, if I still don't trust it, I don't trust it. And then if you can't explain, if you can't make me feel comfortable in saying that I understand that your culture has been used as research subjects, from the very, very beginning. I understand that your religious barriers prevent you from participating. I understand. So if you're not communicating that, and if you don't show a level of compassion, empathy, and understanding, I'm tone deaf to you. And then that also shows that you're tone deaf to that community. So let's start. That's where the communication process starts, when you're dealing with minority communities as a whole, period. And so then after that, so once we develop that relationship and that mutual understanding, then we can move into other things. But until that is understood, and until the research and until the medical community realizes that you have to go back in history, and we're actually training researchers and geneticists to learn medical history, because it's often landed. I always say the Tuskegee and Henrietta Lacks is the PG version of American medical history as it relates to minorities. If you really want to know the truth, and if you want to do this work and you want to make a difference in minority communities so that we can participate and come along with precision medicine, because I feel it as well as an advocate. I struggle with that as well in my own community, but I also understand the fears. But if you want to do this work, you have to do the research. We're flipping it back on you. Do your research on history, and then come back to the community and say, we understand, we get it. And so how can we work together to gain your trust, to work with you? And so it's a relationship building. So that's what I have to say to that.
Candace, that was absolutely beautifully said. Absolutely beautifully said, and so very, very important. We have, let's see, Jen Laws wanted to say something. You still want to say something, Jen? What about you, Yasmin?
Yes, I was just wondering if you can see the chat that I put. So I want to piggyback on what Candace just spoke about. Everything she said is exactly true. I know I'm a patient advocate. I represent several organizations from an advocacy and research standpoint. When I was first diagnosed and clinical trials were brought up, I emphatically said no. And my physician did not understand why I said no, and I had to explain to him, it's historical. Please research and understand what I'm going through and what I'm dealing with. Now I am educated because I sit on several boards and I know what clinical trials represent and how they can help us as a whole. But being a regular patient, these are things that are really true and prevalent in our community. Speaking about COVID also, I wanted to bring up, COVID, of course, is a hindrance across the board with all patients. We can't have our family member come into the doctor's appointments with us. And culturally, that can be a problem. Culturally, some cultures, family is a very important component to all things, especially health. And so when I'm going into an appointment and I'm a patient and I'm ill, and you're telling me that my husband can't come with me, that's a problem. So to the physicians that are here, I know that there are CDC guidelines and things of that nature, but what are you doing to remedy this? Are you offering conference calls, Skype calls with the family? Because just leaving them out of the equation is not helping anyone. It's going to stop getting help.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Jasmine. I think you raise a very, very important point. the way we manage, this is an extremely difficult period, particularly for our patients who are the most vulnerable population for cancer patients, but also for COVID-19. And the way we manage this complexity and difficulty is that there are certain criteria that patients have to follow at the entry of the hospital. So patients who are incapable of making decisions or have certain weaknesses, they are allowed to have with them their caregiver. In addition, for patients who are not allowed to have a caregiver because they do not meet the criteria, my practice is I always want to teleconference to have a video call with their caregiver, because as you mentioned, these patients cannot remember all the specifics of the discussion. So it's very important to engage them, and then I believe give them adequate time to confer, to make the decision, and perhaps in the next visit that may be done as a video call to make the final treatment planning, and then offer them the best treatment that is best for the patients for themselves. But I'd like to take an opportunity to also I admire Candace Henley. She presented very, very important topics. And
before you get to Candace, can I say something? Interject about what you just said?
Yes.
It's not that the patient cannot remember or understand what's happening. It is on a cultural level that this is being done. So it's not about not being able to understand or can't remember or they're too ill. It's about this is culturally, this is what we do.
And we do try to engage. If the way we address this during COVID-19, I mean, is if the caregiver is not allowed to be with them, then we have a video call. So they are engaged. I don't know how many people do that. This is something I try to do in my practice routinely.
But I want to change your mindset in terms of the patient is not too ill. It's a cultural thing.
Sure, this is a cultural. On top of this, because the patients I do treat have advanced metastatic cancer and they're under morphine and pain medications, I think this is an additional layer of complexity. So I totally agree with you.
It's a very good point. And I know when we were hosting patient and survivor forums at Cure Magazine, we would have whole families coming to these programs, and they would sometimes even go off into different breakout sessions to really gather up as much information as they could, and then come back as the family for the end of the program.
Susan, can I bring that back to research just for 1 second? So,
sure.
So first off, I'm just like over here like, yes, exactly. Because some of our global counterparts have talked about how in some cultures there's not even a word for caregiver. One thing I would say that's important to this integration is understanding from the research where caregivers can provide objective data and what their formal role is. So it's not necessarily always, like Yassine was saying, it's not just this person might not be able to make a decision because they're incapacitated. And we may not want caregivers to report out on subjective measures like pain, for example, because the research indicates that they may do that through the lens of their caregiving experience. So really thinking about what is that objective activities that we can bring the family in on, and where do we want clinical provider and patient to really take the lead.
And I just like, oh, go ahead.
Hi, I'm sorry. The doctor was trying to address me. Can she address me and so we can move on?
Candice, I'd like to tell you that I am very committed to make sure that we take an oath as doctors. We do the best for our patients regardless of what their background is, and I totally respect, and I think we should all know the history. I can guarantee you that nothing comes before the patient. The patient it's a privilege to practice. So taking an oath as an oncologist to offer the best care, nothing can stop this. I just want you to be reassured about this. And thanks for presenting your perspective. This is very important to take into consideration the history.
Well, thank you for acknowledging that, because that's not being acknowledged, and actually it's kind of been disturbing that we haven't actually had more of a conversation about this particular piece, because we're not just a small group of people. And so and we have a lot of doctors on the call, and so it's kind of surprising that it hasn't been brought up on the call. I mean, on the panel. So, which is why I brought it up, and I'm surprised that no one has actually weighed in much more on what I brought up. So, but it's very important.
That's a good point, but it also leads to the fact that we have several questions to go through, and some of them are about this very topic. So maybe those comments were being held until a little bit later. Well, I will say Joan Powell is a patient and would like to ask 2 questions from Adolf. And those questions are, what steps is your organization taking for more diversity in scientific research? And is it a legal matter of consent for a caregiver? Do you want to tackle that one?
I'd like to address the last item. So
Adolfo, can you answer that question for me?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Kumar, you want to say on this conference? Can you hear me?
Joan, hi Joan.
Hear me?
Joan. Yeah.
We can hear you.
You had okay. We had several patients that presented. Well, there's several. The voice. Anyways,
yeah,
I live in California. I traveled to the Capitol building and healthcare, but the disparities community at a zip code might be in Beverly Hills, but our voices have to be heard because this is a very, very serious issue. And with the COVID virus, I don't know if all of a sudden it's coming to light, but this has been our history. I just want to ask Adolfo, what is your organization to diversity in the health?
Your microphone was cutting in and out a bit, but I think your question was, what steps is your organization taking for more diversity in scientific research? Okay, we may have lost Adolf. Let's see. I believe Jane, do you have something you'd like to say?
Me?
Yeah.
Hi,
No?
Jane Baker. I currently have 3 family members who are in the process in the last few weeks of hearing about personalized medicine and using it in their care with their family members. Number 2, for the last 4 years, I've coached community college 2 PhD in medical students, and 90% plus are underrepresented. 3, I led a multi-million-dollar patient education initiative at a hospital in San Francisco. And 4, I had the opportunity to lead the strategic recommendation group on personalized medicine for the Sutter Health System. I'm still in Personalized Medicine Coalition because I just think it's such a beautiful organization. I can't quit it. My comment from putting all that together is, I think one thing we can really do to help patients is to tell them what not to do and to give them a time frame when they come to the frontier of personalized medicine in a doctor's visit or whatever. The people I'm seeing, they are all over the place. They don't know what they don't need to do right now. They need help with, where do I need to focus now? Learning this word, learning what this can do for this person I love that I'm freaked out and think is dying soon. Number 2, they need to know what to do next. And then they need to know help with what to do later. And through putting that, my background, I bring to this together, those are 2 things that I think if we could help our patients, and I view family members as future patients. So those are 2 things I think we could do to help our patients and family members with. Thank you.
Thank you. Because we're running out of time, this was such an important question to start with. It makes sense that we took a lot of time really diving into this one. But I feel like some of the comments that have been made during this one part are, we would love more of your feedback when it comes to some of the other questions we're asking, and especially in the case of diversity and education, cultural differences, etc. So let me just read through the rest of the questions real quick, and then I think we are going to take your responses to those questions offline. We will introduce those questions in a summary format before the next webinar starts next week. So, isn't that right, Cynthia?
Yes. Yeah, and I would
Okay.
just say, in terms of the discussion, I know it's been robust and seemed less focused than some of our previous discussions, but a couple of the things that I took from the discussion that I think have been really useful were the comments that that Mike and Grace made early on about ways that you can potentially provide additional support to caregivers through their own grieving process to allow them to be more active participants in their loved ones' care journeys. So there might be something that we can drill down for a specific research question to propose in that area. And then obviously, Candace, what you've been talking about in terms of the need for additional historical education to be the underpinning for discussions with populations who just inherently for very good reasons have distrust in research. I think that's not just exclusive to any one group. We actually do quite a bit of work with the Asian Pacific Islander Health Forum, and that group in particular has been a huge education for us at PMC to understand the challenges that their different populations face just historically and having access to information and being able to make decisions about their own health. So I think there might be some specific sub-points to our first question that we can suggest as concrete examples. So this has been enormously helpful. So thank you very much. But Susan, you're right on point with how we're going to proceed.
Okay. So question number 2, what kinds of new and existing educational tools and resources, including those using digital platforms, we mentioned EMRs a little while ago, what kinds of digital platforms would empower patients and providers with varying levels of understanding about personalized medicine and its benefits, discuss personalized medicine treatment options during visits? Number 3, how can patients and caregivers be encouraged to more actively participate in their personalized treatment when they prefer not to think about it? They want to rely on their trusted medical team or feel inadequate to participate. Next slide. How can conversations between a patient and a healthcare professional about personalized medicine treatment options best address issues related to access and affordability of care? Number 5, how can healthcare professionals and patients navigate language and cultural differences when discussing personalized medicine treatment options or delivering and receiving care? How do a patient's needs and access barriers, including those related to cost and affordability, change depending on the purpose of a genetic test? Example, to identify the risk of developing a disease versus to identify an appropriate treatment. 7, how can outcomes research in personalized medicine consider the impact of treatment on a patient's financial health, psychosocial well-being, and experience in receiving care? These are all great questions, and I think we've touched on a lot of them today. So please take some time to review those questions. I know they were sent out in advance, and give us your assessment of whether these questions are concise enough, relevant enough, and they fit the principles that have been outlined for this project. And I believe, Cynthia, we've already talked about next steps, but you're going to send something out after this call.
You'll be receiving an evaluation survey from David, and one of the questions that I encourage you to particularly fill out is if you had comments or felt that your viewpoints weren't represented, to please let us know that so we can make sure that we cover that in the next 2 roundtables.
So thank you so much for joining us. It is, look at that, it is exactly the time we're supposed to be ending. I think you guys have done a terrific job. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I thank you for joining us, and I hope you'll join us for the other sessions so that your voices can continue to be heard.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
See you Monday, right? Monday?
Yes, our next session will be Monday at 1 p.m. Eastern
Thank
Time.
you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.